am just going to go ahead and start with introductions. That way we can get rolling right at 4:05. So for those of you who are on, thanks for joining us for our workshop today. I'm Caitlin Dalby, the Executive Director for Butte Environmental Council. There's a lot of familiar names and faces in this workshop today. We're super excited to be able to bring you this information today. Today's workshop is really focusing on the CEQA process and providing meaningful comments on environmental impact reports. This one's specific to Valley's Edge specific plan. However, this information is good for any kind of situation like this where we have an environmental impact report to review and comment on in order to propose solutions to what we perceive as environmental impact problems on projects in our area. So that being said, I'm going to really pass the baton off to our very capable advocacy committee team, who I'm very impressed with how much time and effort they've been able to put into this, and I'm really excited to also learn along with everybody else that's here. I think before that we'll do our land acknowledgement and then roll from there. So welcome and thanks, everybody.
All right, welcome. Sure, so I'll give the land acknowledgement for tonight. So we want to acknowledge that as we gather as Butte Environmental Council on the traditional land of Indigenous people, we honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This includes the Berry Creek Rancheria of Maidu Indians, the Morgantown Rancheria of Maidu Indians, the Mechoopda Indian tribe of Chico Rancheria, and the Concow Valley Band Maidu tribe. This calls us to continue to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit.
You want to go to the, hey, Addison, would you, oh, the presentation's already up. Cool. Okay, well, there are some, so a little bit of a primer. The Valley's Edge specific plan was, there is a draft that is published on the City of Chico's website, and with this comes the draft environmental impact report. Jared will go into it a little bit further down, but basically this means that this plan has the potential to have significant impacts that are unmitigatable. So before we do that, we have some terms to know and that are important with this process. The draft EIR had about 7 pages of terms to know, but ours are a little shorter. Most importantly, significant impact. A project impact is considered significant if it results in a substantial adverse change in the physical conditions of the environment. Significant and unavoidable impacts are projects that are considered significant and unavoidable if results in a substantial adverse change, and unavoidable if there is no mitigation that can avoid that impact. Mitigation measures, as I've been saying, can include avoiding the impact, minimizing the impact, reducing the impact, rectifying the impact, or compensating the impact to reduce the level of significant impacts. And all of these terms will make more sense as we're talking about them impact by impact, but less than significant impact is a project's impact is considered less than significant if it does not reach the threshold or standard of significance, and each impact has a different standard of significance. Okay. I think
CEQA?
CEQA, oh yeah, CEQA is the California Environmental Quality Act. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but it is state legislation. In vehicle miles traveled, it is, Addison, do you want to touch on this one for a second?
I'll explain it when I go over transportation impact.
Okay, cool. Okay, Jared, do you want to go into the project impacts?
Sure, yeah, so briefly, I'd like to give an overview of the project. I just dropped the link to the city's webpage. That has all of the information on the project. The draft EIR can be accessed from that link. But yeah, so what we're looking at here is a pretty massive, primarily residential development that's being proposed in between Stilson Canyon and Honey Run Road. And so as you can see here, it's about 1.5 miles wide. It's one of the biggest developments I think the community's probably ever seen And what we're looking at is about 668 acres of residential development, approximately 56 acres of commercial development. And for some reason, the city decides to use the term mixed use when they describe this development, which I think is a gross mischaracterization because the uses of land are completely separated. You have commercial and then you have residential. They're not integrated at all. And the common definition of mixed use is where you have commercial and residential on the same parcel, on the same piece of land. And that's not what we're seeing here. What we're seeing is a largely suburban sprawl housing development with a commercial component to the periphery of this. And so, yeah, I'll give a little bit on the density of the project. So of the area that's devoted to residential development, which is the vast majority of it, we're looking at about 4.1 units per acre, which is pretty low density. And when you start to incorporate the land in the project area that is not residential development, so this whole 1448 acres here, it goes closer to about 2 units per acre, 1.9 units per acre actually. So it will be a very sparsely populated land area on the periphery of Chico, and the size is quite enormous. I believe this is Addison's slide, or
just to make sure everyone can see the slides that we're looking at. There's 2 maps currently.
Yeah, I probably should have put this on when you're explaining that. See that the red down in that'd be the southwestern corner of it. That's the little commercial zone. That dark red is a little bit of multifamily housing, and the yellow and the white is low density. The whiter stuff is like extra low density. I think you're talking about like quarter, half acre lots. And so you can see what's next to it. This is a topographical map. If you're unfamiliar with topographical maps, the closer the lines are together, the steeper it is. And so you can see where the open space is, just where they show kind of some trees, or where this what's proposed as a regional park in the southeastern corner, which is like off of Honey Run Road there. That's all very steep. That's the Comanche Creek, sort of little canyon in there. So when you think about like where, about half the development is open space, that open space is where you have really steep inclines that it'd be difficult to build housing on, considering it's also like lava rock here. And then on what they're calling mesas here, these are the ridge lines. That's where they have the housing spread out. It's you, Jared, right? You're muted.
Sure, so I'll give a brief overview of the environmental impacts that we are especially concerned with. So principally transportation and circulation, air quality, biological species, greenhouse gas emissions, groundwater recharge, and the risk of wildfire.
Okay, so this is back to my part. So those of you that know me know I'm a professional transportation planner. Just kidding, I'm totally not a transportation planner, but I'm like a citizen planner or something like that. What I want to emphasize is that none of this is really that complicated when we're talking about how people are going to get around a place. We all get around places in different ways, whether you take the bus, ride a bike, walk, or drive. And so you should like understand these factors of like it being very remote, how that affects it. Or for example, this here is El Cerrito, California. It's also a hill development, right? And so you got to consider how many people do you think bike with their groceries up here is like, as opposed to the flat ground down beneath is probably less, right? Maggie's from El Cerrito, so.
Yeah, it's very steep. There are some buses that can't go up it because of how steep it is. So it's definitely, you drive. Yeah, and so, you're a senior citizen, you live on a hill, you're probably less likely to bike for the things that you need. And that's just as an example of like how we look at transportation impacts in here. This is like, I swear this is as technical as it gets explaining this. This is the state law portion, but it's also how the environmental impact report is measuring the transportation impact. So up until recently, which is to say July of 2020, the environmental impact of car traffic was measured not by how dependent people are on driving and how much people are driving and what greenhouse gas emissions are resulting from that, but it's something called level of service, or LOS. It's how much congestion there is on the road. So they measure it at intersections. Basically, if at peak commute hours,
you can go very fast in your car. It's considered in this respect environmentally sound. Which I have this, yeah, you know, so you got like clear way to drive very fast, and that was measured until July of last year in California, and still is in much of the country. That's the environmental impact, is if there's congestion. And here on 8th Street, you can see it's like wide open. That means it's like great environmentally sound having a highway running through the middle of the city. So state law required that public agencies stop considering level of service and instead measure the environmental impacts of cars in terms of vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, which takes the concern from will people be driving slower to will people be driving more. So parents, if you catch your teenage child texting something like LOS to VMT, then you might have like an environmental urbanist. So the report found that the vehicle miles traveled that they estimated for Valley's Edge constituted a significant impact. And we'll look at how they came to that conclusion and some problems with that. But let's start just kind of, I'm going to continue with the project overview, but giving it more of this like transportation perspective. So the site's in the foothills. It's beyond the edge of Chico urban area. It's enormous additional context. Walking from the southwestern corner where that commercial is up to the northeastern portion where they have housing. See, there's like a little pocket of low density housing up at the top. That would be like walking from the orchards west of the Diamond Match Factory to the 99 overpass in Bidwell Park. It's about 2 miles. Except in Valley's Edge, you'd be walking up a hill. There's that picture. You can see the site overlaid on Central Chico, where there's Barber, there's part of Chapman Town, there's downtown, there's South Campus, there's part of the avenues, there's the university, the East Streets in 1 mile is all included in it. Yeah, so calling it a mixed use project is kind of disingenuous, I think. And they actually give, so this is part of the vehicle miles traveled accounting that's done in the environmental impact report. They give it a deduction for being a mixed use project. Yeah, when it's not like Marion Park and downtown are actual mixed use projects. Right. From the western edge of the project to East 20th Street, there's a market that's going to Marion Park. It's about 1.2 miles. So that's like the nearest that they'll go towards anywhere. And you'd have to cross Bruce Road, which the city's planning to widen into a 4-lane road. The only place you're legally allowed to cross Bruce Road is going to be an intersection where there'll be 6 lanes. So it's not really conducive to people walking to Marion Park is the point. I assume that their vehicle miles traveled analysis found that. But to give some like positive aspects of it, you know, is like we're not trying to be like insincerely like talking about all the negatives here. These are like the paths and bike paths and trails that they planned for the development. You can see these little blue ones going around are nature trails. They're not really transportation focused. Again, you'll notice they're in the open space portions, which are on steep inclines. But there are bike paths they're planning out there. There's trailheads and something called a heritage trail, and I'm not sure what all that means. Paseo trail, don't really know what that means, but it sounds nice, right? We're not really sure exactly how much of this is going to be publicly accessible. It's probably mostly for the HOA. There's one park on the western side along the bike path that CARD is going to accept. The rest of them are probably going to be in the HOA. Like the big park, which you'll notice there's a very low density section of housing plopped right in the middle. The big park they offered to the city as a regional park, and the city at this point is declining it because it doesn't have the money to maintain it. So in that case, it's mentioned in the specific plan that park's going to be restricted to the HOA or anybody registered with the HOA. Roads within the development are also going to have traffic calming devices, including a number of roundabouts, these little circles you can see there. So we're talking about that walk like in through Central Chico from the Matchbox Factory to 1 mile. You have to cross Park Avenue, 8th and 9th Street, Pine and Cypress, and have all these opportunities to get run over by a car. And in this case, it won't be like that because they're not encouraging fast traffic within the development. Yeah, and the western side, another good thing about this, the western side of the development is a bike path. That bike path exists. It was Old Potter Road. It's the Steve Harrison Memorial Bike Path now. And there's some intentionality being put into like orienting the development to like the commercial and the multifamily on the bike path. So it feels like the bike path is a natural entryway as opposed to an afterthought. And I think that's another positive that some people could comfortably enter on bike, or at least when people are doing their like spandex recreational biking, they'll go by there and not feel like they're second-class citizens entering. Another big reduction that they get on the vehicle miles traveled, which we'll question, is for there being senior housing. You can see this is the phasing, which is to say what they're going to build first and what they're going to build last. About half the units in the project are planned to be age restricted, so you have to be at least 55 years of age in order to qualify to live there. And the way that they rank it in the EIR for the vehicle miles traveled, they suggest that people over the age of 55 drive about half as much, because they figure you're retired, right? You don't drive as much when you're retired. I think it's worth noting this is 55 plus is what they're considering seniors here, but you don't qualify for Social Security today until you're 62 years old, and you don't qualify for full Social Security until you're 67. So they've got a number of years there, and especially given the there's a lot of amenities in this project. The maintenance, the liability from those is going to be assumed by the HOA, but that means people are going to have to pay HOA fees, and it's going to be that much more costly for every additional, like there's going to be a lake here and stuff, and that's all got to be maintained. They're probably going to have private security, and if it's cost prohibitive for people to be living there, then they're probably going to have to extend their work life beyond the age of 55. We would think. So going over that, so we'll look at the impact according to the environmental impact report. Here's a chart. The chart doesn't make sense to you. That it's saying that they expect people in Valley's Edge to be driving about 26.1 miles a day. So that's like driving straight across Chico like 5 times. And they consider that's like that's what they're counting based on all these discounts that I was just naming off. And the whole region, they say, has it as an average per person vehicle miles traveled of 30.5. And if you score over 85% of what is the region's vehicle miles traveled, then they consider that a significant impact. So it's definitely arbitrary. It's situated in the place that you're in, and they're trying to like use the standard of where you're at rather than say that everyone should have as few vehicle miles traveled as living in the middle of Manhattan, which makes sense. However, what area do you think they're using to determine the standard for this? You can see the service population they name is 342,000. So it's not the city of Chico. It's definitely not just the neighborhoods surrounding Marion Park and how much they would expect them to drive. You notice it's larger than the county population, and that's it. They're using the county as the standard to compare vehicle miles traveled impact because, as they mentioned in the EIR, the city of Chico, in this recent change to assessing vehicle miles traveled, has not adopted our own standards to measure the impact. So instead, they default to BCAG's study, so this means you're comparing people in Chico to people in the South County that might commute to Sacramento at a larger rate, or people who live in like Magalia or Yankee Hill and need to drive like 30 miles just to get to a grocery store, right? As opposed to these people who are going to live like 1.2 miles away from a grocery store at the best. I mean, 1.2 to 3.5 miles away from a grocery store. Not only do they use the county population, though, they actually amended those statistics to include trips that they know come from out of the county or go out of the county. So whenever there's somebody, for example, in Yuba City that might work in Chico, they amended the statistics to include them so that they can take their trips as part of the standard that we're assessing this project by. Obviously, it's a little problematic. I mean, every single step that they made in this analysis leads to assuming more vehicle miles traveled for all these. And so when it says they reach 86%, and that's a significant impact, they're comparing that to people who are living in foothill communities and are commuting across county, which benefits them a whole lot. But it still is a significant impact. It's just 1% above what's considered a significant impact. So the EIR recommends that they implement this plan. I'm not going to go into like the details of it. It's pretty weak. It's like basically recommending people do some kind of rideshare program, and they expect that by implementing this like transportation demand management program, that they can get a 1.4% reduction in vehicle miles traveled, and that will reduce the impact to less than significant. So we don't really need to worry about how much people are driving out there. So yeah, could Valley's Edge be better? The EIR offers a couple alternatives, and I want to look at just two of them. One is to not do the project. All of the environmental impacts would be reduced. There would be no environmental impacts. In fact, if there's no project, because that's one alternative that's considered. And the other is increased open space and higher density. It would also, according to the EIR, it would reduce all environmental impacts, although not totally eliminate them. So this is not a conceptual model for growth in Chico. This is a picture of Hong Kong, two pictures of Hong Kong. One is Hong Kong in the 1960s, and the other is a more recent picture. I like the way that it illustrates that that growth boundaries can function very well. And to make a good city, you can see that Hong Kong does not sprawl up into the hills that they have. They actually drew a boundary right there, and they don't allow development in there, and all those hills in Hong Kong are preserved as open space. You can look on a map and see it, and it's an extremely dense city. It's one of the most dense cities in the world, but they don't allow the sprawl to go up into the foothills. They instead build up in there. It's also notable that most people in Hong Kong live in public housing. And in Chico, we have not enough housing in general, and housing that's being built that's too expensive. So I'm going to go over a little bit of the benefits of smart growth, something that the Environmental Council is supportive of. So this is not a compact development. Houses are spread along the ridges with pockets of open space, primarily on the steeper inclines. But the more you would redesign this project and take the houses from the furthest points up the hill and fit them down into the actual edge of the valley, which if you saw the topographical map, the actual edge of the valley is before the end of East 20th Street, where the inclines start to like qualitatively change. So you get a lot of benefits. The higher density you get down below, and the less sprawl you have up above. I would have had these come out one by one, but I didn't make the PowerPoint like that. So people don't have as far to travel to things. The kind of amenities that you have close to you is totally contingent on how many people are around to be sharing those services. So there's got to be a certain market population for a convenience store to be functional, for a convenience store to open. There's really not a lot of chance, and I talked to the planners about this, that Valley's Edge is going to have commercial services that cater to people's everyday needs. They're going to be like some kind of boutique commercial. It could be like a nice restaurant, cafe, I could see, but certainly not like a grocery store, because it won't compete with the big box stores that are nearby when people are already driving on a regular basis. And there's just not enough population nearby to make that feasible. The houses are more affordable by design because you have people, I mean, at a certain point, you have people sharing walls, like in apartments, you have people sharing foundations and sharing roofs. Like in townhouses and duplexes, that's always the case. It takes less to heat and cool houses like that. And so one of the other impacts I think we didn't mention, it's not something that Beck really focuses on, but it is listed as a significant and unavoidable impact, is the view shed. Like when you look up at the foothills, what do you see? Do you see like pristine kind of natural habitat where you imagine like pronghorn antelope, tulip could be roaming, or do you see some McMansions? And people in Chico have consistently over time expressed a desire to not see big McMansions up in the hills, and it is considered this is going to impact the view shed, which I agree that it's not my priority in focusing on it, but it is something I'd like to emphasize, that Valley's Edge is continuing a pattern of a class divide in Chico, where lower income people live low in the valley, in the watershed, and then our elite neighborhoods are formed up in the foothills, like California Park and Stilson Canyon, are both private areas that you're not technically allowed to go up there and just walk around. They expect you to have an ID in California Park, and that's probably similar to what we're going to see in Valley's Edge like this. Well, Chapman Town is downstream from California Park, where they dam up Dead Horse Slough, which would flow through into Little Chico Creek through Chapman Town in prior days. And Marion Park is the site. Marion Park and the area immediately adjacent to Marion Park is going to be home to 6 out of 7 of the affordable housing projects we have planned in the future. There's currently pending in Chico, and all of those people are going to be looking up at a development where they're not welcome for the most part. The lower cost of infrastructure this is also a really important one. All that sprawl up the ridge requires its own sewer and water and electrical and roads, not to mention things like sidewalks and streetlights, and all these are, it's like basic infrastructure, but it's also amenities that require maintenance. I mentioned this before, that even if it's the HOA is to assume the liability for that, that just means that the HOA is going to be that much more expensive for the people, and it's going to be that much more of an exclusive development, and it's that much more prohibitive for even middle-class people to be able to enter into this. Right. So the other, the big transportation impact, that's something that you don't get when you sprawl all the way up the ridges, when you have people dispersed, but you do get the more you give to compact development is like bus service or transit service. Right now, they do mention, which it's almost like kudos to the developers for expressing a willingness to like accommodate public transit by having like a bus pull out or transit stops. But based on the densities they have, they're a long ways off from justifying Beeline running a bus line out there. You have to build at higher densities in order for there to be a ridership that exists. Otherwise, it's just going to be extending out a line that doesn't pay for itself, which is what almost all of our bus lines are that way. And we've had a declining ridership over years. So our bus, because of the way that CEQA has sprawled over time, our bus line is inefficient and stretched out. And new developments, there actually is a general plan policy that's very specific about it. New development should support public transit, but it needs to support it in a way that that's financially sustainable. And there's no way that that the current design in Valley's Edge is going to be that way. You know, I think Jared mentioned, yeah, it's from like 2 to 4 units per acre is the best you get in this development overall. And a minimal bus service, different association of governments have measurements for how many units per acre they would require in order to extend bus routes out. And it's more like 6 to 14 units for like minimal bus service. So they need to multiply the density. If you want to have, like 15-minute ridership, it should be something close to like 15 to 22 units per acre, which would mean that they ought to increase the density by like 4 to 6 times in order for it to be viable for public transit in reality. I think that basically covers it. I guess just to reiterate, the experience with Hong Kong is, how far do you think people in Hong Kong have to walk in order to get to a marketplace? It's not very far because there are so many people located actually in the bottom of these public housing towers that you're seeing. They have commercial, and they have mostly commercial that caters to people's basic needs. So you take an elevator down and then you get it. And I don't expect nor really want CEQA to reach that extent, but I think when we're talking about a special planning area in an area that's on the scale of this, having their own basic services within their locality is something that we should be able to expect, because it has an enormous impact on the dependence people have in getting to these box stores that are close enough. It's close enough to Valley's Edge to justify people going there every day on a regular basis, but not close enough that you can expect them to do anything but drive a private automobile. So the vehicle miles traveled, it's already considered a significant impact, but we believe for a lot of reasons that they're significantly underestimating how much of an impact it is and how out of proportion it is to the rest of Chico. And yeah, I mean, the alternative to increased open space and more compact housing, it reduces all the impacts, that preserves the habitat and all these other things that I mentioned. So for all that, I think that's what would be better in the development. I think I'll leave it there.
Well, the next impact that we'll be discussing is air quality. I'm not going to go into detail with like the ambient air quality standards, but pursuant to the Clean Air Act, our area is monitoring 6 criteria pollutants, and out of those, Butte County is out of attainment for ozone, particulate matter 2.5, and particulate matter 10. And what this means is Butte County has unhealthy levels of those pollutants. With that, the project will the project has two aspects for air quality. One is the project will increase the operational emissions and exceed certain thresholds, as well as there's cumulatively impacts, and the cumulative impacts are significant as well. Going back to the, we're out of attainment for those 3 air pollutants, and the project will result in operational emissions that exceed the thresholds for reactive organic gases, nitrous oxide, and particulate matter 10 that would conflict with we have a state implementation plan, and that is a part of a bunch of other counties in the North State, and so in that it's the Northern Sacramento Valley Planning Area 2018 Triennial Air Quality Plan, and we will be obstructing that plan, as well as those 3 pollutants will result in cumulatively considerable net increase in those. And air quality is super important. It's not just like an environmental thing, it's a health thing. Particulate matter can increase asthma attacks, cause bronchitis, reduce the ability to fight infections, cause premature mortality, and so many other things. Nitrous oxide can intensify allergic reactions in allergic asthmatics, premature death, heart impacts, decreased lung function, and for ozone that we are out of attainment for, but that this project doesn't increase, it can cause permeability in your lungs, and so you'll have to fight more infections. And we'll answer questions at the end. I see a couple of questions coming through. If anyone has questions, we have a little Q&A. Addison, would you be able to go to the next slide? Yeah. Okay, mitigations. We believe that some of their mitigation measures are inadequate. Some of them, so the air quality does have significant impacts, but what they're saying is the mitigation measures with them are less than significant impacts for air quality. And some of the measures are idling reduction, off-site mitigation programs. So they're trying to basically compensate for the impact and pay their air quality issues away. Energy conservation, if anyone's interested, you can email also advocate@becnet.org. I can go into detail with these energy conservation measures, and then also transportation demand management strategies. And some of these include, they actually include only 3 for basically trying to reduce the demand of cars, a rideshare program, an end-of-trip facility, and a commute trip reduction marketing. But what we are saying is that most of the reductions in pollutants are very small or non-quantifiable. For example, for the transportation demand strategies, they said commute trip reduction marketing. So basically marketing for reducing trips is a mitigation measure, but that is just non-quantifiable. And the other issue we see is the compensation. Monetary value into an offset mitigation program is not going to offset the health impacts of pollution in our community. It's not going to offset the hospitalizations due to asthma reactions. It's not going to help increase or decrease mortality for some of these pollutants. And so paying this issue into some offset mitigation program somewhere else is not going to help our community reduce the pollutants that we're facing.
All right, I'll jump in with this next section. And so we're talking a little bit about the impacts they identified to the biological resources on the site. And so here in this list are the sensitive species that have a high likelihood, or at least a moderate likelihood, of occurring on the proposed project site. So this picture on the left here is of the Butte County metaphone that is endemic to Butte County. You won't find it anywhere else. It is in danger of extinction, largely as a result of habitat destruction, including suburban development all throughout the periphery of the city of Chico. And so it is in danger of extinction. And so as you can see here where it says the common name and the status, if it says E, that is endangered. If it says T, that's threatened, and if it says SSC or BCC, that relates to it being a special species of concern. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, the Butte County metaphone, the Valley elderberry longhorn beetle, the western spadefoot toad, western pond turtle, the burrowing owl, pictured here on the right, the yellow warbler, loggerhead strike, other native migratory birds, some of which are protected, the pallid bat, and the ringtail. The ringtail is essentially a wild cat that roams through the forest and the woods and the grasslands at night and does a whole bunch of interesting things. They're a pretty rare species, but they have been observed within a very reasonable distance of the site, actually at the Butte Creek Ecological Preserve. And so there's a high likelihood of them occurring on the site. And so, yeah, the plants and animals, these are the biggest ones of concern here. Could you go to the next slide, Addison?
There are more species, but those are just the ones that were found to have a moderate likelihood, either impacting utilities nearby for the site or on site.
Sure. And so, yeah, so they acknowledge the project has the potential to negatively impact them, but they claim that with the identified mitigation measures that the impacts will be reduced to less than significant. And I think in several of the cases, we'll be making a public comment arguing that they're incorrect in that because we believe there's some deficiencies in their mitigations. And so a common mitigation measure for all of this is the preserve. So they designate of the 1,500 acre of this monstrous site, they designate about half of it to land that won't be destroyed to in a preserve of some sort. And then before they do surveys, one mitigation measure is a survey. So before they do construction, before they come in and grade and destroy and rip up all the habitat of these organisms, they want to see how many are there. And if there are some of these species there, then they might wait for those species to mature, to leave their nests, or in the case of the burrowing owl and some of the other species, they will just trap and remove them. And which I find kind of ridiculous that they think that as long as they don't destroy an animal's habitat while they're currently nesting, then the impact will be less than significant. But nonetheless, by destroying their habitat, they're still taking the species, they're still removing the species' ability to survive by removing its hunting ground, its foraging grounds, and its nesting grounds. And so, yes, and so there's no clear parameter for the metaphone preserve. They do identify where the preserves are going to be and where metaphone is on the site. And yeah, removing the species, and particularly the burrowing owl, where they wrote a pretty descriptive explanation of how they're going to remove this owl from its burrow, we believe could fall under the term taking, which is prohibited under the Endangered Species Act, through the harming, harassing, or the capturing of the species. And as far as the impact to the oak trees on the site, of which there are several thousand, about 1,100, according to the draft EIR, are expected to be destroyed.
However, the developer did say it is less than this, but this is the information that we have gathered from the Valley's Edge specific plan, which is basically a bunch of projects within a plan. It'll be that little mini general plan, as well as the draft EIR. So this is the information we're going off of currently.
And as far as oak trees go, they really are a keystone species to the local ecosystem. They support dozens of species of wildlife and possibly hundreds of species of invertebrates that then support other species of wildlife. So they really have tremendous ecological value for the landscape, tremendous cultural value for the area. And beyond that, they also have an incredible ability of capturing carbon dioxide through photosynthesis and storing it in the biomass, and as well as pumping it into the soil. And so the destruction of 1,100 oaks isn't something that can be just brushed off. Could you go to the next slide, Addison? And so, yeah, so something else that's included in biological resources is what they call wetlands, protected wetlands. And so they define the threshold of significance as having a substantially adverse impact on protected wetlands through direct removal, filling, hydrologic interruption, or other means. And they mention that absolute wetland avoidance may not be feasible, saying that they tried to really cluster these wetlands into the preserves, and I'll show you maps of where those are and what those preserves look like just in a moment, but they acknowledge that they will not be able to protect all the wetlands. And the reason why it is so important in the 21st century to protect the wetlands is because we really don't have a lot left. California has lost over 90% of the indigenous wetlands to the area, and they're really a unique habitat for the organisms. They have other ecosystem services, other values to society, and it's a really beautiful component of the landscape that is diminishing greater and greater, largely as a result of unsustainable development like this project is proposed to be. Would you go to the next slide? And so this next slide is probably the largest wetland this is the largest wetland complex on the site. So this is the northwestern corner. And so all these different colors indicate different types of wetlands. So you have seasonal swales, seasonal wetlands, vernal pools, vernal swales, and wet meadows. And so I'll be arguing in the public comment that this wetland complex would face hydrologic interruption, which is a threshold of significance, as a result of the development that is happening around and above these wetland sites in the drainage area. Would you go to the next slide, Addison? All right, and so here is the proposed land use map next to where these wetlands are. So as you can see, it's primary open space, that dark green up in the upper left-hand corner of the map. It's primary open space, so they are not going to be destroying these wetlands through development directly. But I argue that the vast development of residential structures and roads proposed to occur upslope of all of these wetlands, which is located in the north drainage, will interrupt the hydrology and potentially cause substantial adverse impacts on the wetlands. And so the EIR identified this impact as less than significant, but I don't think because of the preserve, they're saying we're preserving the wetlands, so it's going to be less than significant. But I don't think they adequately acknowledged the hydrological interruptions that are bound to occur as a result of the development uphill of these drainages, as well as the level of toxic pollutants that are bound to wind up in the drainages of the site from leakages from cars, from herbicide residues and fertilizer residues that leach from urban development most commonly. And so, yeah, they make a case on how they're going to reduce the toxicity of runoff from the development through best management practices and low impact development standards, such as minimizing hardscape and leaving native vegetation when they can, and having like retention basins and all these different things. But I don't think they adequately demonstrate that it will reduce the toxicity enough. So yeah, so the water quality impacts could also impact these wetlands here. Could you go to the, Maggie has something to say.
He's gonna move on soon.
Yeah, okay, so let's go on. So yeah, as you can see in this map, it's in the north drainage. And so, yeah, and then this is where all these homes are going to be developed, most primarily low density and very low density residential. All right, so we'll keep going on. Next slide. And so, yeah, so this other map was from the geotechnical report. The little squiggly lines are indicating of springs or groundwater seepages, where water seeps up from the earth. And they don't overlay the map of where these springs are in relation to the development, but based on comparing them side by side, it does appear that they're going to be developing on top of a spring that could be feeding into this wetland complex, or at least they'll be developing significantly in and around it. Go on. This is another wetland site. It looks like these are primarily seasonal swales here, and this is in the northeastern corner of the project site. Go on. And this is another area of wetlands occurring on the southwestern corner of the site. And so I will give them credit where credit's due. They are not developing over a lot of wetlands. They are preserving a lot of them as open space, but nonetheless, they are still going to be destroying wetlands, and I will argue adversely impacting them by the adjacent development. And so to mitigate this, because they do acknowledge this potentially significant impact, they say it'll be less than significant because they'll do a no net loss policy. They'll follow the state's policy that basically says you can destroy wetlands as long as you preserve, restore, or create wetlands somewhere else, which I find wholly inadequate because, as I mentioned before, we've lost so many wetlands already. There's really no guarantee if they create these artificial wetlands, if it will provide the same value to the landscape and the same aesthetic value and the same hydrological value these current wetlands are providing. You can go on. All right, so this next section is greenhouse gas emissions. And so this, according to the Environmental Impact Report, was one of the 2 areas where there are significant and unavoidable impacts of greenhouse gases. That means no matter what they do to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions, there will be significant emissions. And by significant, what it amounts to is 17,700 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emitted per year during the project operation. So this is going to obstruct the attainment of the climate action plan. And I think the EIR was really disingenuous when mentioning local regulations such as the climate action plan. They tried to claim that it's consistent with the climate action plan, and they cited some of the policies, and one of them was claiming that this mixed use development falls in line with what the climate action plan calls for. But this is not mixed use. Don't let them deceive you. And it's completely obstructing the attainment of the climate action plan, because by 2045, the CEQA climate action plan calls for the per capita CO2 emissions to be 0 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year per person. 0. And this project is saying, and that's by 2045. And this EIR is saying that by 2045, once this project becomes operational, that it will be emitting 17.7 thousand metric tons of CO2e per year. So it's going to not only preclude the city of Chico from meeting its climate action plan goals, but cause a significant increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And something else worth noting is the EIR talks about climate change, goes into depth about the impacts that we'll be experiencing here in Chico, significantly higher average temperatures, as high as they estimated the extreme heat days, like the hottest days of the year could be as much as 10 degrees hotter by the end of the century with climate. So they acknowledge climate change, they acknowledge the primary causes, first of which is the emissions as a result of burning fossil fuels. The second of which is land use change. But the project EIR does not acknowledge how the proposed land use change of converting agricultural land, rangeland that has grassland that sequesters carbon, oak that sequesters carbon. By converting that into urban development, you're also exacerbating climate change. CO2 emissions are emitted as you grade a landscape, and all these grasslands are capturing carbon just through the very nature of doing photosynthesis. The soil is storing carbon, and sealing that off with asphalt and concrete is going to exacerbate climate change in and of itself, irregardless of the greenhouse gas emissions from the fossil fuel consumption on the site. And so this is something that really is unacceptable, and something that we really need to make sure that development in Chico is actually going to fall in alignment with our climate action plan and be the kind of development that we need in the 21st century, given this crisis we're faced with the climate. Should we go to the next slide? And so, yeah, as I mentioned, loss of agricultural lands and climate change. I got this image from a Butte County SALC presentation. This image is from the UC Cooperative Extension, though. And the Butte County SALC program, SALC, is about sustainable agricultural land conservation. And they identify how Butte County can make significant strides towards meeting climate action goals by the very nature of preserving agricultural lands, farmland and rangeland, as well as by implementing various carbon farming practices that increase CO2 sequestration, including managed grazing, so managing the livestock in a more intelligent way, compost application, tree planting, and various things like that. So the county has a really good webpage. I encourage everyone to go to it. Just Google Butte County SALC. It'll come up, and they have some really good information on the importance of conserving ag lands. And so one thing I will mention is that the city of Chico has a green line, primarily to the west, which is designed to conserve the farmland there. And more people are discussing about the importance of developing something similar to the Green Line, but on the eastern boundary to preserve the agricultural land up there and ensure that the development of Chico will go in the way that we need to. We definitely don't need to go as extreme as Hong Kong with the density, but we could have higher density within the urban core. We could redevelop Park and make that a lot more dense, Park Avenue. There's a lot of opportunities to increase the density within Chico, provide the amount of housing and the type of housing that would meet the housing needs of the community without destroying this land that provides so much value to us. So that would look like something like an urban growth boundary. It's not clear what that's going to look like, but progress could be made on that in the coming years.
Okay, next slide. Next slide. That was a just random one. Okay, wildfire impacts. This land is within the wildland urban interface, so that means that the like wildlands interfaces with the urban areas of a city. This site burned during the campfire and will likely burn again. It discusses, we have a quote in there from the draft EIR, fire is expected within the blue oak foothill pine habitat every 5 to 15 years, and this type of habitat is found on the site. CAL FIRE has identified the location as a fire hazard, and it is considered moderate fire hazard area within the state responsibility area. And in our terms, like, new developments should not be proposed in areas known to burn. We as a community definitely know how, like, impactful having our communities or communities around us burn. And so it's super important to not develop and not plan for developments to be here. This was a lot of information, so we'll pause for the next couple of minutes just to have people just think about this, and then we will jump into the solutions-oriented aspect of it, CEQA. So.
Reading session. That's big information. Thanks for everybody for coming and being willing to, like, get so, like, wonky and into it, because we need people to do this. And I know everybody's not going to, and people have a lot of concerns about project and an interest in it, people who live nearby that don't have the time to go through this all. But Jared and Maggie have spent a ton of time going through this, Susan too, and Lacey. And I happen to have not had a job for a little while, so I was able to spend a lot of time on it.
I'll just chat for a second. So I don't think Addison discussed this, but one thing that people keep saying about any development near Chico is we need housing. I think it's important to note that we need housing in the right location, in the right type of housing. I'm not even talking about sustainable development, but for Chico's RENA numbers, you know, the numbers that basically show what type of housing we need, we have met our above moderate income for housing by 146%. The type of housing we need is, you know, just average income, as well as low and very low area median income housing. And so this housing is not going to be that. And so when people keep saying we need housing for the residents that live in this community, not for retired LA residents that want to come up here because it's a cheaper cost of living. And so that's something to definitely take into consideration as we're discussing all of these impacts for this development.
This is Deborah. I know that we just went over the RENA numbers Tuesday at the Board of Supervisors meeting. And so you're saying that we've met that by 146%, but they're showing over the next 8 years, I can't remember what the number was, but I think the units, I can't remember the unit number. Have you seen that new report?
No, I'm
probably talking about the countywide report and
yes.
Chico specific. I know that Oroville has, I think their above moderate income housing is like as bad as Chico's low income housing. So that might balance out in some respect countywide.
Okay, so you're talking just the RENA numbers for the city of Chico.
Yeah. And we're given in the Chico housing element workshops. Yeah, that's where we have that source from. I could actually project it on here.
It's published in the Chico Enterprise Record as well.
And it's also important to note this area is supposed to be annexed into Chico, and so it'll be considered in the Chico area. So.
And has it been analyzed as a recharge area?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. It has been analyzed, and the draft EIR acknowledges that a relatively impermeable lahar flow underlies the majority of the site. And so lahar is not optimal ground for groundwater recharge. There are breaks in the lahar where some recharge could be occurring, and the EIR and the geotechnical report analyzes that and ultimately comes to the conclusion that it's less than significant. This project will have less than significant impacts to groundwater recharge. But however, I am concerned that there's not a map showing where the lahar is and where the lahar isn't. And one of the statements in the geotechnical report mentioned that when you're developing a foundation of a house on or partially on the lahar flow, there needs to be an accommodation made for the seepage from the groundwater that could occur in those sites. And so that really is inferring that there are areas in this project site where the lahar flow is completely absent. But yeah, I would like the final EIR to include a map of where the lahar flow is, where it isn't, and overlay that with the proposed where the proposed impermeable surfaces would be, so we could evaluate the groundwater recharge a little more thoroughly than was done in the draft EIR.
So are you asking for that then?
I will be in the public comment I submit, yeah.
Okay, great. And then I just have two more questions.
Hey, do you want to pause? We have our Q&A.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. I thought this was it. Okay.
No, this was just, this is a lot of information. Do we just want to pause for a second? So,
Yeah, maybe take a break or something.
Addison, you want to jump into the next, but keep those questions. We really, they're really important. You want to jump into the next one, the CEQA one? Okay. So going back to this important thing. So CEQA is a landmark, a piece of legislation passed, I'm pretty sure in 1975, and it gives communities, it's super important because it gives communities a voice in this, as well as tools in land use decisions, requires local governments to be transparent around large environmental large projects that may have the potential to harm the environment. And this is why we're doing this. Communities can push decision makers to adopt alternatives and mitigations to reduce impacts or to not approve the project altogether. And CEQA basically happens when there is a project that is subject to CEQA, and for it to be subject to CEQA, I won't go into detail, it needs to be a discretionary project, and it needs to have the potential to impact the environment. CEQA has a couple of different processes. One starts with the initial study when you first start to look at the impacts and you're like, okay, there are some impacts, or there aren't any impacts. If there aren't, it'll go to a negative declaration. If there are impacts, but they can totally mitigate all of them, it'll go to a mitigated negative declaration. But if there are impacts and they are significant and at least some are unavoidable or maybe unavoidable, the environmental impact report process of CEQA starts. And so we had the scoping and notice of preparation, which was in November 2019. Beck has been following this development since then. We've been waiting, and that in 2019, people were asked, what do you think, what needs to be taken into account? What comments are you worried about, or what are you worried about for this development? Beck didn't do anything then. I just joined the board and we had a transition, but we're here. And so as you can see from the little timeline, we are in the draft environmental impact report and public hearing area. And so there is a 45-day written public comment period that started on October 28th and ends, I'm not sure Friday.
December 13th.
Yeah, December 13th at 5 p.m.
And as Maggie mentioned, the public hearing, the city of Chico is holding a public hearing on the draft EIR next Thursday at 6 p.m. at City Council chambers. The hearing is done by the Planning Commission. I encourage everyone to attend and continue to read more about this development on the city's website before that meeting. And I do encourage you to make a public comment. The public comments made there will be summarized in the draft EIR, but so it really highlights the importance of doing the written comments to ensure that all of your comments are included in the final EIR, so they can be analyzed.
But we're doing this workshop to hopefully get all of you to the public hearing on next Thursday, next week at, I think, 6 p.m. at City Council chambers, as well as to write that public comment and submit it to mike.zolli at chicoca.gov. We'll have that email in our resources and links in the end. But it's important to, you want to move slides?
Yeah, just to clarify, it says 5 p.m. for the public hearing on this image here. 6 p.m. is the correct time.
Yes.
6 p.m. Yeah, they're always 6 p.m. Planning Commission meetings. Okay, right. Yeah.
Okay, well, this is just the overview of what we'll be going over next. All of these we'll be discussing. Next slide. So reviewing the EIR questions to think about. One, the Butte Environmental Council has come up with a little fact sheet, and I'll be sharing it. It's on Google Docs, and I'll be sharing it now. But
I'll do it later. Focus on that.
Okay, cool. This document is 712 pages, and so I think it's important to be able to pick and choose what impacts you are what to analyze. Right here. But here are some questions that we have been thinking about as we've been going through the draft environmental impact report. What are the significant and unavoidable impacts? For this project, it would be the aesthetics as well as the greenhouse gas emissions. Do the mitigation measures really reduce the significant impacts to less than significant? For example, Jared discussed some of the mitigation measures for biological species, and we believe that they are inadequate. What are the thresholds of significant level based on the project and site conditions? Jared also discussed greenhouse gas emissions, how actually the level of significance should be the 2045 climate action plan target rather than the 2030. Does the EIR provide clear reasoning in its conclusions related to impacts, level of significance or non-significance, and mitigation levels through mitigation measures? And does the EIR address all of the relevant environmental impacts? Like we said, this is a huge document, and so we have done the courtesy of going through it, and we have a fact sheet that we'll be sending out at the end of this presentation for you to definitely do a jumping off point. Next slide. Cool. Okay, content. For the content of your public comment, reference the project by name, Valley's Edge, a specific plan, be fact-based in your comments, and include sources you use to gather any technical data or information, use proper English and proper punctuation, and be clear and concise with your comments to ensure your take-home message does not get buried underneath excess words. Next slide. Become a local expert or justify your expertise. State your background, include your education, training, experience, community standing, and appointments or offices you hold. Like if you're a certified California naturalist, if you have been doing bird surveys on the site for the last 10 years, if you hold if you are a commissioner or a committee member for an organization or for the city or the county. These things can help you distinguish yourself as an expert in the process and can leave a more lasting impression on your audience. Next slide. Structure of content. Comment should be structured in the standard introduction, body, inclusion format. Using this format will assist you as well as your audience organize your thoughts and follow along easily. Use the introduction to introduce yourself in your position, the body to explain it, and the conclusion to reiterate your position from the introduction as the take-home message. And use page references because this document is so huge, that's super important. Next slide. Presentation of oral comment. This is specifically for that meeting next week at 6 p.m. Be aware that your appearance and demeanor will be the first impression you present. Dress professionally, acknowledge the local governing body, the City of Chico Planning Commission, and be prepared. Limit your focus to the topics being discussed. Be courteous and polite, and use facts and examples and adhere to the time limits. The time limits, I believe, will be 3 minutes, so that's definitely something to take into consideration. Upon completion, thank the governing body and submit your written speech for the record. Next slide. Items to avoid: don't swear, wear inappropriate attire, ignore the rules of the hearing, partake in name calling or threats, or intentionally insult the governing body, staff, or project applicant. Next, okay, our local CEQA experts. We have 2 local CEQA experts, either experts by trade or experts as in citizen expert. We have Susan Chudy and Richard Harriman. Susan is co-host of Ecotopia, helps convene the Environmental Coalition of Butte County, and is a member of our BEC Advocacy Committee. Richard Harriman is general counsel for the Northern California Environmental Defense Center and is a longtime BEC member. Thank you too for, oh, well, wait a second. Let's see. You want to just go back to the local CEQA experts? Hey, Richard and Susan, are you ready?
Yes, we're here.
Yes, I'm ready, and I'm going first.
Yes.
And Richard will be second.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to start by introducing the fact that the Valley's Edge Pacific Plan is beautiful. housing for young and old, green spaces, parks, a pond, walking and biking trails, a little commercial village. On paper, it's beautiful. In real life, the development is in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is a 19th century project when there was land to be developed and money to do it. And this place is 1,448 acres of wetlands and oak savanna that is inhabited by a complex ecosystem filled with plants, animals, some endangered, some threatened, and some of special concern. This is no place to build 2,770 units. All of the power, money, and political clout around the side of Valley's Edge. In order to resist it, we have to be active, vocal, strategic, and smart. And I'm going to use my training as a rhetorician to talk about how to be strategic. And Maggie has mentioned some of these things already. I'm going to give you more or less a formula to think about this. In classical rhetoric, we talk about creating arguments considering ethos, logos, and pathos. Rule 1 is that you adapt your arguments for different audiences. In this case, the audiences are Mike Solly, who stands in for the city as the collector of all of the responses to the EIR, the Planning Commission, to whom we will address ourselves next week, and I'm afraid at some point the Chico City Council, and the general public. In all cases, ethos is important. Maggie talked about this a little bit. Claim your authority. Ethos is the authority, reputation, and character of the speaker. You may work as or a volunteer as an environmentalist and have knowledge of, for example, fires, endangered species, birds, water, wetlands, and so forth. You claim that authority. In my case, I would say I'm the co-host of Ecotopia, an environmental program. I convene the Environmental Coalition, and I'm on Beck's Advocacy Committee. A regular old Joe or Jill can also claim expertise by having studied something deeply and carefully. So say that. I have studied this, I have looked in detail. Logos addresses the facts, the evidence, the knowledge, the information. Logos will be very important in writing your message to Mike Solly with your comments on the EIR. The EIR has stated that the project has unmitigatable impacts with greenhouse gas emissions and with the aesthetic, the viewshed issue. The impact on the viewshed is significant, I think, and I don't think it's, I think it's something that people will want to talk about. Other impacts, according to the EIR, are mitigatable and therefore not significant, but we are arguing, all of us on the advocacy committee and others who are following this issue, that they are not adequate in many cases, and Jared and Addison and Maggie have already pointed that out. But you need to take a deep dive into whatever area you want to concern yourself with, because they don't care about how you feel about it. They want to know the facts of the EIR. So write specifically to the information that's in the EIR. And you have to substantiate any claims that you make with evidence. You can't say, well, it's not going to be as pretty, or, you know, you're going to have to really say, this is what the environmental impact is. Here are the areas under review. And so think about where you want to go, where you want to spend your time when you're preparing to write and speak about this project. Aesthetics, we already mentioned. Cultural and tribal resources, greenhouse gases we've talked about, very significant in this project. Hydrology, water quality and drainage, very significant in this project, though it says it's mitigatable. I don't agree. Noise and vibration, which for an ecosystem of creatures, not so good. Transportation, Addison spoke to that. Air quality, energy, hazards and hazardous materials, public services and recreation, and public utilities, wildfire, biological resources, geology, and soils. So this is really important. Your written comments on the draft EIR will go into the record and must be responded to. So be specific and detailed and make them come back with an explanation or a mitigation or something. We need to press the project to do the right thing. And so you're going to have that commentary that's there. And you don't want your comments to be dismissed. So you have to make sure that your facts are straight. And so it's a careful process. I have a letter written by Scott Huber. I'm going to read it in a couple minutes because I think that it is a really great example of a factually based and pointed letter. And he's writing on behalf of the Alta-Cal Audubon, and he's writing to Mike Solly. And I consider this kind of a perfect letter, but I'll come back to that. Pathos addresses the emotional and ethical arguments. In addressing other audiences, I think that you can have a mixture of logos, facts, evidence, information, and pathos, emotional and ethical appeals. In speaking next week to the Planning Commission, I think you want to rely on evidence, but you also want them to understand why this project is important to you, why this issue is important to you. I plan to focus on natural resources in my comments when I address the commissioners. And I'll talk about a lot about the threat to the natural habitat, the limitations of the mitigation efforts, the loss of trees at a time when big trees are an important part of the climate change issue. But I'll also talk about the loss of this beautiful piece of land with flowing waters, 38 species of migratory birds, endangered Butte County meadowfoam, frogs and bats and beetles. We are interdependent, and threats to these species are threats to us. In writing letters to the editor, again, you can use pathos and logos. I think a combination is really effective. You want to convince people that this issue is worth their attention and their action. So you need to argue, convince, appeal to others in ways that will touch their hearts and their intellect, their minds. They need to think about the negative impacts on our whole environment. So your assignments, write a factually based comment to Mike Solly about the inadequacies of the EIR in whatever area you most care about. You need to do a deep dive and you need to be specific and concrete and true. Speak to the commissioners a week from today about your knowledge and understanding of this land and appeal to their better selves to save something, to make this something that they give focus and careful attention to. Write to the CEQA ER and the CEQA News and Review, calling on others to see the impacts of this project and to care about it and hopefully lead people to action. That's what we need. Also, if you're in an organization or the head of an organization, you need to alert your members to act in the same way. As I said in the beginning, the power and the money and the political clout are on the side of Valley's Edge. It will take the efforts of many vocal, strategic, thoughtful, determined people to resist this. Now, I'm going to quickly, I might not read this whole letter. How much time do I have? What time is it?
You have about 6 more minutes.
Okay, and that leaves time. Thank you, Lacey. That leaves time for Richard, right?
Take as much time as you want, Susan. Your comments are really useful.
This is to Mike Solly from Scott Huber, speaking on behalf of Alta-Cal Audubon. In regards to a request for submittals on the adequacy, and this is about Stonegate, sorry, this is when we were in that fight, of the Stonegate Development Draft Environmental Impact Report, Alta-Cal Audubon Society respectfully submits the following. The following inadequacies were found in Section 4, Environmental Impact Analysis on and it's Part D, Biological Resources. In reporting on avian species, the draft EIR relies heavily on Shuford and Gardala's California bird species of special concern, which was published in 2008. In many cases, species populations have continued to decline significantly from the time of this publication. Given population changes within the last decade, alternative resources should be utilized for more current species population information and trends. Because of the conversion of habitat to housing, farming, industry, grassland birds are among the most threatened avian group, and the most recent population information should be used and considered. Potential impacts on all the following species are understated, and further local declines are virtually guaranteed if this project is to be developed. So he talks about the white-tailed kite first, and it says the impacts on the fully protected white-tailed kite are understated in the EIR. The species account should reflect the serious population decline of the species. The EIR correctly identifies the project as a critical habitat for this bird, the white-tailed kite. In a study in Santa Barbara, biologist Mark Holgram determined that the white-tailed kites were threatened locally by conversion of habitat and disruption of movement corridors where it forages for food and travels to roost communally. Recently, Holgram described an overall trajectory of decline of the kite at a meeting with planners of the county of Santa Barbara. He suggested that kites may be affected by development, and even though they are still around, their connection to their habitat has been seriously undermined. So we already hear his authority as someone who's looked at all of these things, who knows it deeply, and who draws on other authorities who also know it. The grasslands, I'm going to go on a little bit longer. The grassland oak interface habitat niche required by the white-tailed kite is rapidly disappearing in the Chico area, as most suitable areas have been converted to housing, including developments along Eaton Road Extension, California Park, Oak Valley Homes, and Little Chico Creek Estates, Marion Park, and Doe Mill neighborhood. Not only would this project eliminate one of the last remaining local foraging habitats, but the valley oaks in the southeast corner of the project, and as you heard, there are thousands of oaks on this property, but they're, you corrected this a little bit, Mandy, that they're not going to take all 1,000, but this is just without, they can take things of a certain diameter without permits. So they're just talking about what they need permits to take. And so it's not just the old oaks, which we desperately need because they take forever to grow. So we need these old oaks for CO2 and sequestration. And 1,000 oaks is a lot of oaks because they're old guys. He talks about the Western Burrowing Owl, and Jared already talked about that a little bit. They have been, I'm going to skip a little bit. Western Burrowing Owl populations are in a free fall statewide. In nearby Yolo County, in 2016, the Burrowing Owl Preservation Society Institute for Bird Populations did a large county-wide survey which showed that since 2006, there has been a 76% decline in burrowing owls. And he goes on to show how in other counties it has been diminished as well. And then he talks about the loggerhead shrike. It's not mentioned in the section on grassland species, even though its species spends its time in this kind of habitat. It is a common species in deep decline, he says, and at one time it was a common species, but they've been pushed out of their habitat. He talks about the yellow warbler, another California species of special concern. And so, you know, find out which species are, I mean, if this is the one that you're going to do, are of special concern. So he says the yellow warblers, California species of special concern that regularly occur on the project site, but were not included in the EIR. Because of their size, they're often overlooked by birders. Yellow warblers are associated with both riparian vegetation and the valley oaks within the area. And they, Jared talked about how there'll be surveys to see what creatures are there. It's a time and point survey, number one. And number two, there will be species that are overlooked. It's just common sense. I don't think you can draw on common sense to make some arguments here. So to repeat, and I don't need to repeat this a whole bunch of times, but this is a factually based account that uses numbers and statistics and expertise to challenge the EIR. And that's your job when you write to Mike Solly. and partly when you talk to the county, the planners, planning commission, the commissioners. I just want to mention one other thing about affordable housing. And a lot of what is in this plan, in the Valley to Edge specific plan, is in direct contradiction to what the general plan, mind you, the general plan is outdated, but to the general plan and what the general plan calls for, which is compact urban form, density, and infill. And this is none of those, obviously. It also, the climate action plan calls for a decrease over time until we reach net zero emissions in 2045. And Valley's Edge is going the opposite way. The housing element update has not yet been approved by the council, but the old one still emphasizes the need for affordable housing. The new one places huge emphasis on the need for affordable housing. So those are other things. If you want to look at those 3 documents, they're available on the county's website. And those are 3 other kinds of arguments that you can make. But you have a bunch of letters to write. So I'll let Richard tell you more about how to do that.
Okay, Richard, if you want to just follow up, I do have 2 guiding questions. One, what have you done to read these draft environmental documents effectively? They're so huge. As well as what have you done to write effective public comments? You can choose what you want to say.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to try to summarize the things that I think are the shortcuts to being effective. And Susan really covered all of the bases, but you're going to have 2 different opportunities. One is going to be written comments that we focused on here today, and those are the most important. When you do your oral comments, frankly, I would make a friendly amendment to Maggie's thought. I think when you have a written script to present before the Planning Commission, submit the written comment, go and present it to the clerk, ask them, bring in 10 copies or whatever, and give them to the clerk and have them handed in for 2 reasons. One, they'll hand them out to the planning commissioners or to the city council people. They'll go to the staff and they will go into the administrative record. And one of the things I wanted to say after working on the Stonegate project is Susan and Stephen Chudy's comments were written comments. I didn't hear them in the public hearings. I found them to be absolute gold when I needed to get substantial evidence into the record. So I want to read something that's going to sound a little bit repetitive, but I would like you to memorize it and put it indelibly in your memory. And I'm reading from section 15384 of the California Environmental Quality Guidelines, and it's called substantial evidence. I'm going to read just a portion of it. Argument, speculation, unsubstantiated opinion, or narrative, evidence which is clearly erroneous or inaccurate, or evidence of social or economic impacts which do not contribute to or are not caused by physical impacts on the environment does not constitute substantial evidence. Substantial evidence shall include facts, reasonable assumptions based upon facts, and expert opinions supported by facts. So the words that you never want to utter in orally or in writing is I think, I feel, I believe. You can have all the feelings you want, they aren't going to help you. They're valuable as an emotional part of an argument, as Professor Chudy said, but for the lawyers, who is the real audience here, I need facts. I need you to have to say, this was omitted, this was wrong, this was improper, whatever, and say the reasons why. The low-hanging fruit on comments on EIRs are what is omitted or what they failed to cover. So going back to Maggie's lead question to me is, what do I do when I read an environmental impact report? I have a punch list for myself, but it's a third or fourth derivative punch list because I've been doing it for 45 years. But typically I look for the places where I think they're going to have the weakest arguments or the hardest problems, and I focus on those, because without taking those on, you're giving up your primary targets of opportunity. So for example, one of the things that occurred to me, and Deborah Lucero, I think, commented on it briefly, was water source. After going through the CEQA process, I don't see anything in the EIR that addresses what the impacts might be on groundwater of the groundwater wells that they will be relying on for Cal Water. The second thing that I would suggest that you focus on is the land use issues around the density that were very well presented by Addison and others are great. But I think what we have to do is present an alternative that they want to consider. So under alternatives, you want to say, look, if you want to do this, you've got to cluster all of these dense uses in one place so you can maximize the open space and not use it. It's a profligate waste on the density here. So when you criticize something, you also want to include the proposal that would make it right, because if they grant the permits, you're going to want to get your evidence in there so that they have to consider using that. The other thing that Addison discussed was the lack of a jobs housing balance analysis to show how many people are going to be living there and working there and how many people are going to be having to come in to work. The other thing that wasn't discussed that in our discussion here is there's going to have to be a widening of 20th Street, I believe, in order to accommodate the traffic that's going to go in and out next to Doe Mill Road, a Doe Mill project. And I believe it's going to have to go to a 4-lane. And I don't know whether that's addressed in the transportation section. The other thing that is very significantly outdated in this particular document is that Senate Bill 9 was passed by the state legislature and signed by the governor into law, and it will go into effect after the new year when this project will be approved. And what that bill does is it provides for 4 units per every single family residential zoning that is in that project. That has not been analyzed in this EIR. So there's a target of opportunity. The other issue that Maggie touched on, and she and I talked about, so if you look at the wildfire analysis, one of the things that would be very useful for somebody to bring up is to look at the campfire and what were the distinguishing features that caused that fire to be so difficult and so damaging. And if you all recall, November 8, 2019, about 3 weeks after Stonegate was approved, the reason that the fire came so far down is that the winds from the Jarbo Gap were bringing embers and blowing them over the lines that the firefighters were able to establish. This particular project is going to be subject to exactly that same thing again coming up in the future, especially if the winds are higher and the the fuel comes down to this project. The other one that I found particularly interesting in the EIR as I was going through it was migratory birds. I think there's a lot to be found in that, and with the federal statutes and the guidelines on that, I think that may be a very valuable and useful target of opportunity for you to look at. The other issues that I would like to see you develop or look at is I didn't see anything in there about requiring solar. Solar should be mandatory, but you also want to look at having requirements that all vehicles that are used for public transportation are electric vehicles. For example, BCAGs, buses, the public transit system, there's a situation that they're going to be addressing that they say they will, but won't really happen. The other issues that I would be focusing on is if you're going to have senior residents there, and this was brought up in the air quality issue, air quality has to be especially carefully analyzed for senior citizens and others that have chronic respiratory conditions like emphysema and the like. Further, if you are going to be destroying the oak woodland, is that necessary? And where could you relocate on site the oak trees that would be available to mitigate the impacts? The other point I want to raise in some detail for you, because I'm concerned about it from the Stonegate experience, you're going to be encountering findings of overriding consideration that are going to be adopted to supply the reasoning for the city council to approve the project. That'll be one of the biggest problems with the greenhouse gases. And so to the extent that you can focus on the reasons why it is important that they not adopt findings of overriding consideration for the greenhouse gases volume, look very carefully at the climate action plan, both the current one and also the one that has been adopted, and I believe it's in effect right now. I think Maggie already raised that issue. I wanted to address also on the wetlands, are they if they're proposing to do a replacement or a number of additional replacements for them. We had 19-1 in the Stonegate EIR, and you should be arguing for maximum amount of mitigation for any that is recognized as being taken. And on that point, I have the same concerns that were expressed, I believe, by one other speaker. And that is, I think that some of the phraseology that's used in the EIR is going to suggest that they may be doing a taking of the T&E species that is violative of law. So I think we should focus on that one. Let's see. Going back to some of the comments that were made by the previous speakers, I think that the mixed use argument is very, very strong and should be emphasized. And you should also show that in doing that, that the housing element is not only inadequate, but also this project does not comply with it, even if it is adequate. I think that was Addison's comments earlier today, this evening. The other thing I thought was particularly useful that was referred to earlier has to do with the BCAG standards versus out of county and for the urban area of Chico, and that the transportation management plan is really very, very inadequate. You can beef up on that. Make sure that you make comments on what should be done in addition to what is wrong. And to the other thing that's a very simple tactic for improving your written comments is there is no page limitation to limit your comments that are made to the EIR. And so if you want to cite to a particular source, best thing to do is make a copy of it, or make a copy of the page that you're planning to cite and attach it to your statement. So for your oral statement, you're going to have maybe a page or two that you're able to say in 2 or 3 minutes, but also include copies of the things which you are intending to cite in your arguments that you make. I find that's one of the most useful things, especially if you attach it to the handout. Then you can have underlined or things, for example, if you're referring to the general plan or any other document, make a copy of the page, mark the portion that you're going to read that you want them to look at, so that when you're speaking, you're handing them a document, it's 1 page, 2 pages, they follow, and you can mention the attachments to it. That is as good as gold. It really gets a positive response, and it really makes it hard for the city and the applicant to address it when you've got chapter and verse there. I'm going to I'm going to cut off my comments right now in hopes that there will be some questions coming back to Susan and me that we might field, if that would be useful for the conveners of this workshop.
That's great, Richard, Susan. Yeah, thanks a lot with that. I think Maggie got kicked out somehow, but I think they're back in now.
I just got back in. Our cat knocked over the Wi-Fi. So wait, let's go back. Okay. Let's see where we are left.
Question and answer.
Yeah, question and answer.
Yeah. So I want to go back to one of Deborah's questions because Deborah Lucera, she's been so patient, having asked it like a good hour ago. And there's a straightforward answer. This one was, is this going to be a gated community such as Canyon Oaks? And the answer is no. But I want to cite because there is a relevant general plan policy, and then a shout out to everybody that was involved in forming the CEQA 2030 general plan, because I really like this one. It's in the community design element. It says, do not allow new gated subdivisions because they isolate parts of the community from others, create an unfriendly appearance, and do not support social equity. So if we take that seriously, then that would mean that gated communities are illegal in CEQA as a result of probably pushback after Canyon Oaks. So while this will be a private HOA in the specific plan, it is specific that like the lakes they plan and the regional park that if it's not accepted by the city, that those will be access will be limited to HOA members or people registered with the HOA is their phrasing. It's not really clear about the rest of it and to what extent. Obviously the commercial and there's an elementary school that will be CUSD, and in a park that I think CARD is intent on accepting, those will be publicly accessible. I think the rest of the development's intent on not, but no gates.
Did anybody else have questions of Susan or me, or may we merge into the audience?
I think you guys can merge into the audience. We can start the Q&A question, and questions can come up, and if they are like slated for you, you can speak,
Thank you, Maggie.
Cool. Well, I jumped on, and since we got kicked off, could maybe Lacey or Addison read some questions?
Yeah, I can pop in. So Deborah had another question saying, where do you get the air quality standards? Is this in reference to every day, just certain times, or I'm sorry, just certain times of the year, or what?
So I know that for ozone, there's like a 1 hour as well as an 8 hour. The information I'm getting this from is straight from the draft environmental impact report. And so I can definitely get back to that specific question, but they are
typically certain times of the year, though. It's not,
yeah.
The city is not always out of attainment for those criteria pollutants. It's on a certain time period.
I believe it could be also a 24-hour period. Like if you're out of attainment for a certain amount of time, it is pursuant to the state and federal ambient air quality standards. I do believe particulate matter 10 is only out of attainment for state, and particulate matter 2.5 and ozone are out of attainment for the federal standards.
Okay, so why I was curious is I just wondered what Butte County Air Quality Management had to say about that, or what their comments were, because I sit on that board and I just don't remember us. I do remember us being out of range, like during the Camp Fire and during the fires of this year, last year, but I don't know about a general statement, I guess is what I'm saying, of just us being generally out of compliance.
Yeah, it sort of seems like it's general out of compliance, and the Northern California triennial, we basically have an attainment plan to reach, I think, to get back into like general attainment by 2035, and before the mitigation measures, we would have issues with the exceeds thresholds of reactive organic gases, nitrous oxide, and I believe particulate matter 2.5 or 10.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Maggie, may I make another comment on that air quality issue? There's a documentary evidence, at least in the San Joaquin Valley, of this phenomenon of heat, the compression layer on the top of the air basin. And what happens in the summertime is you have air quality get worse as the warm air comes down, and then it rises again in the evening. So if you're on a hillside like this project is located at, you're going to get caught in the worst kind of air quality that comes up during the evening when it's cool and then comes down in the morning when it's hot. So, or the reverse, whichever way it is. And so this may be a special area, maybe especially significantly different from just the ordinary basin.
Or also Butte County and Chico have issues with air quality because of our inversion, as well as we get air quality issues from Sacramento. It blows up here, and I know Paradise has an issue getting attainment. Some of the issues of why we're out of attainment is just because of our geographic conditions.
But that's a baseline. That's the baseline that you're getting, and that's also something you might want to look at in terms of cumulative impacts, is that not only are we getting the impacts from this new development, but we're also getting the growth that's coming up from Sacramento and the future growth that's going to come in as a result of the funding from the state for the development in South Chico, which will then exacerbate the air quality.
I have a question, if I could squeeze one in for Richard, I think, which is, you know, you've been clear that we want to focus on the specifically environmental impacts of this as opposed to social and whatever impacts. But is there a point in the process when it does become appropriate to focus on some of those other things, like, for example, public access to the open space within this thing? Does that come at a later stage in the process that we want to argue about that?
That's an excellent question, David. I'm glad to hear it. What we encountered with Stonegate was a twofold issue of the adequacy of the environmental impact report, which we did not challenge and we probably would have lost. But the second one is when you're talking about land use issues and general plan issues. So the feature is we're focusing on comments on the EIR, but that doesn't mean you can't make comments about general plan, land use issues, social equity issues. And in fact, the point that I would pick up is that we don't have in the city of Chico yet the environmental justice element that's required in the general plan statute. I think I can do it from memory as section Governmental Code section 65302 subsection H, and it came in several years ago. It's not yet been adopted because our general plan hasn't been updated since that statute. So back to your point, absolutely you can make comments regarding handicapped issues, equity issues like we were talking about, senior citizens, that are not strictly environmental. Absolutely, yes. They say, well, they're not related to the EIR, but the issue needs to be addressed. And if you get it into the comments on the EIR, then I or another subsequent attorney or the attorney for the city has to review it.
Okay. One other really, yeah, that is. One other really oddball one is, a lot of people may have forgotten this, but just several years ago, on the property immediately to the north of this, when that development was pretty new, there was a brief but intense downpour, and because of the poor permeability of the soils up there, there was a pretty devastating flooding to a group of houses up there. And I wonder if anybody's looked at the potential for that that sort of event to occur in this property. That seems like it has some potential.
That's a great idea. And I don't know whether or not Jim Brobeck is participating here today, but I think also the issue of the hydrological relationship between Valley's Edge and the down gradient Stonegate preserve, and that's a double-edged sword as well, because the preserve, the Schmidbauer preserve that was formed between the Chico Creek diversion canal and the property line, which is the Valley's Edge property line, that's a preserve now. And so question, what is the potential impact on the species that the preserve has been reserved for or conserved? I don't know whether I don't know whether they have hydrological data on it in the EIR, but that would be something I would definitely focus on.
Thank you.
I can speak to that for a moment. This is Jared Geiser here. The EIR mentions that they're hydrologically separated by that bike path. But based on my analysis, I didn't see adequate justification for that claim.
It isn't the bike path. The bicycle path, though, is on the west side of that Smidbauer Preserve, and so the impact on the hydrological configuration there is going to come down into the preserve. It may even come down all the way. It probably doesn't come down past the diversion canal, but the preserve that is to the east of the body of the existing Stonegate development is certainly going to be potentially impacted.
Interesting. Thank you.
David, to your point, I did bring up the flash flooding concern, especially with removing those wetlands at the on the western edge, because any amount of wetlands, and it's not just those wetlands down at the western end, but also anywhere you see those oaks that are growing, so the thicker oak woodlands are going to have not just hydrologic flow, but also the natural ability to mitigate those flashy storm systems that do cause severe rapid flooding. So that has been brought up, but I'm not as intimately familiar with the EIR still as the good folks on our advocacy committee are, but that's been a same concern of mine that I've brought up to the developer as well.
So David, I'll say one last thing on that. I think it's a valid concern you bring up, and I would encourage you to look into the EIR a bit, because they do look at the flood hazards based on like severe, like 2-year storms, 10-year storms, like the biggest storms, and then 100-year storms. I haven't looked at those sections myself, but I did glance over that. So there is some level of analysis on that.
That point, Jared, I'd be concerned about historical data. Historical data is what defines a 2-year and a 10-year and a 50-year and a 100-year flood. And we're in obviously, unprecedented times right now. So historical data doesn't really help when we're talking about future storm systems.
That's a really good point, Caitlin.
Before we'll continue the Q&A, but it seems like there are a few people who have been dropping off. If you would like to leave your email in the chat, please do so. If you want to know more about this, drop your email in the chat. You could also email advocate@becnat.org. You could, if you're on Facebook, follow us on Facebook. We'll be having some social media posts following the public hearing, as well as the last day of the written public comment period, and we'll be having a fact sheet come out probably tomorrow. We looked at it, it's not exactly finalized yet, and so if you email us, it'll be ready, and the newsletter. Okay, cool. Are there any other questions from the audience? Any lasting concerns?
I have a quick question. When will the recording of this be available and where?
In the coming weeks, it will be available, I believe, on the Beck's YouTube channel, and we'll probably post it to the Facebook as well.
And the website.
And probably the website. But yeah, I expect it to be posted to the YouTube.
Thank you.
I'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you everyone for staying with us for such like an intense 2-hour workshop. We really appreciate it. Yeah, follow back on whatever platform you feel comfortable. We'll be publishing we'll be commenting at the public hearing the next week at 6 p.m. on November 18th. Make sure to put in a public comment before written before December 13th at 5 p.m. to mike.solly@chicoca.gov. But follow us. We'll be putting out some more information on effective public commenting, as well as a fact sheet of the critical environmental issues that we see.
Please attend the hearing on Thursday if you can, where you can learn more about this, as well as make your voice heard, quite literally.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Maggie, and everybody who prepared this. It was a great program. Thank you.
Thanks so much for our local CEQA experts for giving your time and energy to this, and for everyone else that has spent time researching this and engaging in this process.
Also, one last plug, if you're really interested, you can go on to the Planning and Conservation Leagues like CEQA Advocacy. They have some great information too. And donate to Beck. We do important things.